One of my relatives passed away suddenly. I never met the woman. She had a daughter who was 4 years old. The little girl's name was Yuki. Her father wasn't able to raise her on his own, so he asked my aunt to take care of her. The little girl refused to be left alone and never left my aunt's side. It started to become a problem. My aunt couldn't go anywhere without Yuki. She constantly needed attention. Even my aunt's own daughter started to get jealous. One day, my aunt told me she had to go out of town for a couple of days and asked if I would babysit the little girl for her. I said it would be my pleasure. I lived alone and I could do with some company. A few days later, my aunt dropped Yuki off at my apartment. As she was leaving, she took the little girl aside and said, "Yuki, please be good. Behave yourself." When my aunt was gone, I tried to talk to Yuki and play some games with her, but the little girl's behavior was very strange. She had a teddy bear tucked tightly under her arm and never let go of it. She never smiled, she never spoke. All she ever did was sit quietly in the corner and stare at the wall. It made me kind of uneasy. I was trying to find something that would entertain her. I just bought a new digital camera and I decided to let Yuki play with my old one. When she saw the camera, her eyes lit up. I showed her how to use it, and she went around my apartment taking pictures of everything. There was a bright smile on her face. That evening, I discovered how difficult Yuki was to deal with. Whenever I tried to leave the room, she started crying and screaming out my name. I couldn't leave her alone, or she would create a huge fuss. She even insisted on going to the bathroom with me, which was very embarrassing. At bedtime, she refused to stay in the spare room and insisted on sleeping in my bed. I read her a bedtime story, and after a while, I managed to get her to go to sleep. That was when I noticed her teddy bear. One of its legs was charred and blackened, as if it had been burned. It made me wonder. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a strange noise. When I turned over, I saw that there was something wrong with Yuki. The little girl's body was trembling and shaking. Her eyes were wide open, her teeth were chattering, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. I held her close and asked her what was wrong. "She's looking at me again," she mumbled. "Who is?" I asked in surprise. "The dark woman," replied Yuki. She wouldn't say anything more. I tried to tell her it was just her imagination, but she kept shaking her head and whimpering. It took me a long time to get her to go back to sleep. The next day, Yuki was fine again. She loved playing with my digital camera. When it was time for her to go home, I told her she could keep it. Yuki hugged me. Although she didn't say anything, I could tell she was overjoyed. I dropped the little girl off at my aunt's house and stayed to have a cup of tea. My aunt thanked me for taking care of Yuki. We spent a while chatting at the kitchen table. "Poor little thing," said my aunt. "She hasn't said a word since her mother died." I couldn't contain my curiosity. "How did Yuki's mum die?" I asked. A strange look came over my aunt's face. "She died in a fire." "How did the fire start?" I asked. "Well," my aunt hesitated, unwilling to talk about it. "It's a very sad story. She committed suicide. Yuki's mother was a very troubled woman. She poured gasoline over herself and lit a match. She burned herself alive." "OMG!" I exclaimed. "How horrible!" "Yes," said my aunt. "Her family was so shocked, they hushed it up and pretended it was an accident. We had a small funeral, but only close relatives were invited. Yuki wasn't there. She doesn't even know her mother is dead. She thinks her mother is just on a long holiday. We haven't had the heart to tell her the truth." "Poor Yuki," I murmured. My aunt nodded her head sadly. "Poor Yuki." A few days after that, Yuki died. My aunt was trying to change Yuki's behavior. At night, she forced the little girl to sleep in her own bedroom. Even though Yuki screamed and cried, my aunt left her there alone and locked the door. In the morning, she found Yuki lying motionless in bed. The poor little girl was dead. Nobody could understand what had happened. The coroner couldn't determine a cause of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. She was perfectly healthy. She had just mysteriously died during the night. There was no explanation. After the funeral, I went back to my aunt's house. Everyone was very sad. She returned the digital camera I had given to Yuki. I took it home with me. It was something to remember her by. The memory card was full of random photos that Yuki had taken. I browsed through them, wiping a tear from my eye. There were pictures of my apartment, pictures of my aunt's house, Pictures of flowers, dogs, toys, candy. Silly pictures that a child would take. Then I came to the last picture, and it made my blood run cold. My hands were trembling. One night, a father and his daughter were driving down a deserted country road. They were returning home after spending the entire day visiting the girl's mother in hospital. Listening to the sound of the rain drumming on the car roof, the girl began to doze off. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The father struggled with the steering wheel, but the car skidded off the wet road and slammed into a stone wall. After checking that his daughter was uninjured, the man got out of the car to survey the damage. Both of the front tires had large punctures, and the right fender was crumpled against the wall. The rest of the car had survived unscathed. "We must have driven over something on the road," he explained to his daughter. "Whatever it was, it blew out both of the tires." "You can fix it, right?" asked his daughter, somewhat shaken by the accident. "No," replied her father, shaking his head. "I've only got one spare in the boot. I'll have to walk back into town and find somebody to tow the car," he said. "It isn't that far from here. You wait in the car while I'm gone." "Okay," she said reluctantly, "but please don't take too long." The man could see in his daughter's eyes that she was frightened. "Sit tight," replied her father as he slammed the car door. "I'll be back as soon as possible." His daughter watched him in the rear-view mirror as he trudged off down the road in the pouring rain and disappeared into the night. More than an hour passed, and her father still had not returned. The girl began to wonder what was taking him so long. She was very worried because he should have been back by now. Just then, she glanced in the rear-view mirror and saw a figure in the distance walking towards the car. At first, she thought it was her father, but when she turned around to take a closer look, she realized that it was a strange man. He was dressed in overalls and had a big bushy beard. He was carrying something large in his left hand, swinging it back and forth. Something about him made her very nervous. As he approached, she stared out the back window and squinted her eyes. In the dim light, she could just make out what he was clutching in his right hand. It was a big, sharp butcher's knife. Thinking quickly, the terrified girl locked both doors in the front of the car, then jumped into the back seat and locked the rear doors. When she looked up again, she saw that the strange man had stopped in his tracks and seemed to be staring directly at her. Suddenly, the man raised his arm, and the girl let out a blood-curdling scream. In his left hand, he was clutching her father's severed head. She just kept screaming and screaming. She couldn't stop herself. Her heart was pounding and she struggled to breathe. The grotesque expression on her father's face was horrifying to behold. His mouth was hanging open and his eyes were rolled back in his head. When the man reached the car, he shoved his face right up against the window and glowered at her with his crazed, bloodshot eyes. His hair was wild and matted with dirt. His face was covered in deep scars. For a moment he just stood there, in the driving rain, grinning at her like a madman. Then he reached into his pocket, took something out and slowly lifted his left hand. He was holding her father's car keys. One day, a young married couple went hiking in the mountains. As the sun began to set, they realized that they were lost. The wife was getting worried, but her husband tried to calm her down and assured her that they would eventually find their way back to their car. However, after walking for hours, they still had no idea where they were. It was growing dark, and the man and wife were getting desperate. They didn't have a map or a compass with them, and all of the trees looked the same. Just when they were about to give up hope, they came across an old cabin in a clearing. The cabin looked as if it had seen better days. It was dilapidated and seemed like it hadn't been used in a long time. Some of the windows were cracked and broken, and a lot of the tiles had fallen off the roof. The husband knocked on the front door, but there was no response. When he turned the handle, it slowly creaked open. Inside, they found it was in a bad state of disrepair. There was very little furniture, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. As the couple cautiously looked around, they noticed a strange atmosphere and a peculiar musty smell. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with graffiti. Written in red paint, the words, "Death, Death, 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 death were repeated over and over again. The man and woman were unnerved. With a shaking hand, the husband reached out to touch the wall. He was horrified to find that the paint was not yet dry. The couple were very frightened, but they had nowhere else to go. They knew that the mountain was dangerous at night, and there were lots of wild animals prowling the woods. Despite the creepy writing on the walls, they decided to stay the night. Going upstairs, they found a moth-eaten mattress that was covered in stains. The husband and wife wrapped themselves in an old piece of carpet to keep warm and tried to make themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. They lay down together on the mattress and eventually managed to fall asleep. Sometime after midnight, the couple were awakened by a strange rustling noise. It sounded like someone or something was moving around outside the shack. "Did you hear that?" asked his wife. "I think there's somebody out there." Her husband listened for a while, but he didn't hear anything. He got out of bed and walked over to the window. It was too dark outside to see anything. Opening the window, he stuck his head out. "Who's there?" he called nervously. There was no answer. He was about to go back to bed when his wife said, "Maybe it's someone who can't speak." The husband returned to the window and said, "Is there anybody out there? Clap once for yes and twice for no." He strained his ears to listen. The stars twinkled in the night sky. The crickets were chirping loudly. All of a sudden, he heard a loud clap. The man turned to his wife and said in surprise, "You were right. There's someone out there." He leaned out the window and his eyes scanned the darkness. He couldn't make out anything in the pitch black. "Are you the owner of this cabin?" he asked. Clap, clap. "Are you a man?" Clap, clap. "You're a woman then?" Clap, clap. "Are you human?" Clap, clap. A chill ran down his spine. He swallowed hard and croaked, "Did you come here alone?" Clap, clap. "How many are with you?" Clap once for each person. 20 clap.